So in this next video, we're going to be looking at how our broader psychology, through the form of our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors, are all interconnected and really rooted in this nervous system approach to wellness. And so as a part of that, I want to introduce what is a common concept in the cognitive behavioral therapy world, which is the connection between our thoughts, emotions, and actions, this triangle. Looking at an event that will happen and then initiating this triangle with thoughts that we have about ourselves, thoughts about that event, beliefs about ourselves, which affect the emotions that we have. And through the nervous system lens, we're looking at emotions as an interpretation of our physiological sensations. So I'm lumping these together here. Our thoughts and beliefs impact our emotions and sensations, which then determine the actions that we take or the behaviors that we have, which then in turn shape our thoughts and our beliefs, and the cycle keeps going. So we can find ourselves in cycles that can be somewhat downward spiraling, as well as the inverse, upward spiraling. And what we're going to look at in this video is ways to observe what's happening in ourselves, not just what's happening with our sensations and in our nervous system, but also connecting the dots between what's happening in our nervous system to what are the actions we're taking and what are the thoughts behind those emotions. We're also going to look at how to interrupt this pattern and shift it and potentially get it going in the opposite direction. So let's start with an example. Let's say that you are a caretaker of some sort. Maybe you have a child or children, or a loved one with an illness, or an aging parent. And as a caregiver, your plate is full, and there are times when it feels like you have no time for yourself. And in general, a belief might be, I haven't done enough. A caregiver, because by definition, the person they're caring for continues to need help, there can be a sense of never having done enough. So if you hold this belief, I haven't done enough, then what emotion might come out of that? Certainly a stress response, a sense of being maybe unworthy or useless, or a sense of feeling overwhelmed or agitated. There are a lot of different emotions that could come. I would say irritability can be one of them. I haven't done enough, and so then I feel irritable. Well, what are the sensations associated with irritability for you? For me, it might be a tension in my shoulders and a tightening in my jaw. And as we discussed in the introduction to the nervous system, that tension then leads to more thoughts that are looking for the threat, right? So with this tension related to irritability, based on the thought that I haven't done enough, then my actions, my behaviors might be to go faster and do more and try to just do as much as I possibly can for the person that I'm taking care of, and filling my time, my days, my nights with activities that are caregiving oriented. And the faster I go and the more I do and the more tension in my body, does that shift my thought? Usually not. Usually that doesn't shift my thought to, oh, now I've done enough. It actually worsens the thought because all that tension has me oriented to the threat. And I use the word threat to mean our nervous system interprets the threat like a tiger, even though the threat is just that someone needs care. So my thoughts and beliefs deepen around the fact that I haven't done enough, and maybe it becomes I can never do enough. And if I feel like I can never do enough, then if I think that I can never do enough, then I might feel completely overwhelmed and hopeless. And if I feel hopeless and my sensations in my body that are associated with hopeless are one of giving up, of numbness, then what actions or behaviors might I have? Again, it can range person to person, but it might mean that I'm all the more frantic in my actions, or it might mean that I start to isolate and guard myself emotionally and stop connecting on a person to person basis. And so you can see how this would create quite the downward spiral. Well, so then the question becomes, what do we do about it? Well, we have already looked at different ways to affect our body sensations, right? By helping to orient to safety, we can shift the way that our body feels. But we can't just automatically change our emotional response to something. So let's look at how we might be able to shift our thoughts and beliefs and our actions. Well, if we're practicing our observation skills through mindfulness, through watching our body, through slowing down and tuning in, then we can create some space here between emotions and actions. We can create some space to first identify what is our action urge. So if we feel a certain way, before we take action, can we notice, oh, what I want to do, what my action urge is to fill up my day to do so much more for this person I'm taking care of, is to create a checklist to get everything done, to have more control over the situation around me. Maybe that's the action urge. Well, the way to counteract the action urge would be to choose an opposite action. So what is an opposite action to filling up my day with a checklist and making sure that I get everything done? Lots of opposite actions. For me, I might name the opposite action would actually be to carve out some time where I do nothing. To carve out maybe an hour where I'm not doing anything on a checklist for someone else, but instead I'm taking care of my own body. And if I were to do that for myself, what is the belief that that would trigger? Well, that would carry with it a message that I deserve some time. So there I've moved from I can never do enough to I deserve some time. I need some time. Time for myself is important. And how might that shift my emotion? Instead of feeling irritable and frantic, just the thought of it right in this moment, honestly, helps me to feel a little more calm. It helps to create a little more space in my breath. And if I feel a little more calm, how's that going to lead to shifting my actions? Well, it helps me to slow down in what I'm trying to do and accomplish every day. And you can see how in this example started to shift the cycle in the opposite direction and create a positive reinforcement that ultimately one could argue helps the person I'm caregiving even more than my franticness and irritability if I'm helping them. So let's look at another way to interrupt this cycle would be to identify what are our stuck thoughts. So if I have the thought, I can never do enough, that might be a stuck thought. It certainly is black and white in its thinking. Anytime we use the phrase never, always, extremes such as that, usually there's a stuck thought behind it. So as a way to practice flexibility in our thinking, we want to identify, well, what's the opposite thought? What's the opposite thought to I can never do enough? Well, if we really want to go with the opposite, it would be I can always do everything, which is silly, because of course I can't. But just by identifying the opposite thought, it helps me expand my thinking and get a little more flexible, and then land in the middle and say, well, actually, it's not that I can do everything perfectly all the time, but it's also not that I can never do enough. Some days I get a lot done, And some days I find myself wishing I could do more. But the truth is, I'm somewhere in the middle. And by acknowledging that I'm doing quite a lot and that, of course, I can't do it all, my emotion then starts to shift. And maybe I'm not feeling so irritable as much as, gosh, I feel like I just gave myself permission to be human. So I feel a little bit of relief. And when I feel relief in my body, I feel like a little bit of letting go in my shoulders, a little bit of ease come in. And when I feel a little bit of ease come in, then my actions again are not as frantic. And they're maybe more present. They're more infused with mindfulness and maybe more connection to the person that I'm with. So that's one example in terms of a caregiving role. But you can see how, again, by trying to interrupt that stuck thought, I'm able to reverse the cycle and create space for positive reinforcement. So taking this and applying it to your life, I want to invite you to think of something that you do well, or better said, a positive belief about yourself, something that you like about yourself. So I might say, I am a good listener. I listen well. And then as you give yourself that acknowledgement, notice what emotions and sensations stem from that belief. It feels good to acknowledge a strength that you have. So as I name that, I'm a good listener, that makes me feel somewhat content with myself. And the sensations that accompany that, I notice an ease in my forehead and in my cheeks that comes up. And what does that make me want to do? It actually makes me want to go be around someone that I care about. It makes me want to go be with someone. And being with someone can then keep this positive cycle going. So either during this video, if you pause now, or at the end, I invite you to write out for you where that positive belief goes in this circle. What emotions it sparks and what actions. And then inversely, to also take this triangle and apply it to a negative belief or thought. Something that you might struggle with to some degree. A thought that comes up currently somewhat often. And to notice, how does that feel in your body? What emotions get triggered? And then, what do you know about the actions that normally leads to? But this is where we want to pause and say, okay, those are the actions it normally leads to. Those are the action urges. What would be the opposite of that action? So if that negative thought about yourself leads you to feeling kind of tense in your body and sad or angry or some other emotion that leads to an action urge that maybe doesn't help you so much, identifying the opposite. And also, can we come back around and identify what is the thought and what's the opposite of the thought? And is there room for an in-between? So this would be a helpful time to name that oftentimes our action urges are attempts to try to regulate our nervous system, but they're attempts that don't work anymore, or maybe never did work. So let's say, for example, that an action urge, when you're not feeling so great, is to just go plop down in front of Netflix and kind of tune out for the rest of the night because work was hard and you're over it. So when we look back at our nervous system, if we're operating up here most of the time, and then it's too much, and so we just want to relax and we turn to our screen time, what do we know about that? Is that it tends to actually numb us. And it's not the way to get back into our zone of resilience. So things that we'll often turn to are screens. Alcohol is a natural depressant. Distraction through, lots of different things, different forms of drugs. Marijuana can be used actually both as a depressant, and it can also kind of become a bit of a stimulant that sparks anxiety. We might turn, if we're down here in this low place, we might turn to caffeine or other stimulants to help us come up. Self-harm can come into play in both of these swings, where trying to feel less causes someone to turn to self-harm to just express those emotions in some way, or desiring to feel more because they feel somewhat numb can cause someone to turn to self-harm. All of these attempts to regulate our nervous system, they come from our body's good intentions, and yet ultimately they're not helping our nervous system feel safe and learn that it can operate within this zone of resilience. Another note about this zone of resilience is this zone can be really narrow or really wide depending on factors from earlier in our life. So the home we grew up in, the adverse childhood experiences we navigated, our biology, we're learning more and more about what is getting passed down through epigenetics from our ancestors and generational trauma. All of these factors set us up to either have a more narrow or more wide zone of resilience. The good news is it's not permanent. That distance between these two dotted lines can change. Sometimes a big trauma event will happen and that distance gets smaller, where suddenly we can't handle too much fluctuation in our activation or settling before we find ourselves out of our zone and in that place of overwhelm with anxiety or depression. At the same time, we can grow that zone just like we grow a muscle by working the edge of it. So if you were working on trying to increase the size of your bicep, you would not just hold a weight in your arm, right? You would do repetitions and bicep curls. Similarly, we don't want to just be on all the time in our nervous system. That's actually going to cause all kinds of adrenal fatigue and health problems down the road. We need to exercise our nervous system. And so by stressing our nervous system intentionally, but within reason and within our wellness capacity, and relaxing our nervous system intentionally, real, true, deep relaxation without bottoming out into that place of numb dissociation, will help us work the edges so that over time, the zone that maybe started here starts to increase. Things that help to work those edges, well, one is certainly with awareness, so that we're not going beyond the edge. But also things like exercise, where we are intentionally activating the sympathetic nervous system, heart rate increases, respiratory rate increases, and then when we stop exercising, what happens quite naturally? Our parasympathetic nervous system charges, and we calm and rest and recover. So through exercise and through meditation and mindfulness, we can start to work these edges and grow our zone. I would also offer that through individual counseling support by someone who is trained in this technique, somatic experiencing, a therapist, especially with someone who has a trauma in their background, can help to safely work those edges and become another set of eyes tracking the nervous system so that we're not launching out of the zone in either direction. So as we work through our triangle of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, we can also navigate, well, what are the action urges we're turning to, and are they helping us to be in our bodies and therefore grow this zone of resilience? Or are they distracting us and numbing us and kind of helping us get through without fully embodying our process? So again, I'd like to invite you to take a look at that triangle and think of your own examples and write them out and take the time to note and observe and describe the sensations your body experiences, the actions that you take, the beliefs you have about yourself. Look for ways to choose alternative actions, opposite actions, and look for ways to challenge your stuck thoughts. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's an invitation to explore your patterns with curiosity to see if you can create some room for choice and change.